I would like to welcome you all to the semi-finals of the World Schools Debating Championship 2008. Let's start off with a warm applause. The motion for this semi-finals will be: this House would drop all US sanctions on Cuba. On today's proposition side, we have Team New Zealand. Proposition speaker Ben Cornfield. The second proposition speaker will be Mana English. The third proposition speaker Jen Savage, and the reply speech will be given by Ben Cornfield. But on today's opposition team, we have Team Scotland. Natalie Smith. The second opposition speaker will be Rachel Watson. The third opposition speaker will be Joanna Farmer, and the reply speech will be given by Natalie Smith. Give it up one more. And of course, this debate will contain the best judges seen in this tournament. We have Art van der Steur from the Netherlands. From Canada, Todd Golding from Australia, Martin Pollard from Wales, Peter from Singapore, Jan Tulis from the Czech Republic, Aston Wheel from Israel. I assume that both the teams and the audiences are familiar with the timekeeping. I'll go through it one more time. After the first minute, the bell will ring once. After the 7th minute, the bell will ring once. And after the 8th minute, the bell will ring twice. Points of information are only allowed within those after the first and before the 7th. Well, ladies and gentlemen, let's get going. I would like to introduce the first proposition speaker, which is Ben Cornfield.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Cold War ended almost 2 decades ago, and communism is no longer the threat we thought it was when Nikita Khrushchev was engaged with us in a space race. Definitionally, today's debate asks whether we should remove all US limitations on trade which are exclusive to Cuba. We propose that the US would remove all trade sanctions on Cuba. That is, restrictions on trade, such as the prevention of the transfer of goods. And furthermore, we would say that US citizens would be able to travel to Cuba with a visa and vice versa. Normal United States trade policies would remain intact. What we are going to prove is that continued sanctions on Cuba are unnecessary, ineffective at achieving their goal, and harm Cuban citizens, and thus they should be removed. We're going to prove this to you with 5 substantive points. Firstly, that unilateral sanctions are unnecessary and ineffective. Secondly, that engagement offers better incentives for cooperation from Cuba. Thirdly, that removing sanctions will lead to greater economic prosperity for the Cuban people. My second speaker, Maria, will show you how removing sanctions will result in long-term political liberalization and how US sanctions unfairly punish the Cuban people for what is not their fault. And that brings me on to my first substantive point. And we see that sanctions have been on Cuba for 47 years to try to get regime change. They have been unsuccessful, and right now, ladies and gentlemen, at this point in time, they are unnecessary for several reasons. Firstly, we see there is no longer the precedent for these kinds of sanctions. The Cold War is over, ladies and gentlemen, and we trade, no thank you, with the communist regimes of China, we trade with Vietnam, and there is no specific reason why we should not trade with Cuba, no thank you, which in fact has a better human rights record than either of these 2 nations. The only reason we don't at the moment is because of a small but politically powerful group of Cuban exiles in the swing state of Florida who are still bitter about the fact that the Cuban people were liberated from Batista by Fidel Castro. And we say it's time for them to get over it, and it's time for the US to remove these sanctions, which are now completely unnecessary. But furthermore, we see that these sanctions, like they have been for the past 47 years, are completely ineffective. Firstly, because the conditions for the removal of these sanctions is that the regime steps down. And this is simply not in the regime's best interest, so they're not going to do so. It hasn't worked for 47 years, it's not going to work in the next 47. Secondly, no thank you, we see that the regime is not under internal pressure. The same people living in Cuba now supported the revolution when it happened, and they still support the regime that exists. All that sanctions do is create resentment among those people to the US and further create support for that regime. In fact, there are some perks to living in Cuba, like great health care, and if you're a child, a stipend of 1 liter of ice cream every week. Thirdly, we see that Cuba has support from South America. People like Hugo Chavez provide them with oil, provide them with food. There simply isn't any pressure coming from the unilateral US sanctions. And the final reason they're ineffective is because they are, in fact, unilateral sanctions. Even the United States, I'll take you in a minute, ma'am, closest partners, like Australia, trade with Cuba. Australia provides Cuba with the dairy products to make that ice cream. When it's only the US who has these sanctions, they're not very effective at all. Wouldn't you agree, ma'am?
However, if you remove the sanctions, that gives an active reward for this lack of change.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just showed you why these sort of sanctions to prevent this sort of change were unnecessary, because we do trade with China and we do trade with Vietnam. But furthermore, I'm going to show you how we can provide the carrot of engagement to Cuba when we remove these sanctions and incentives for change. But let's look at examples, no thank you, where isolation hasn't worked. The best example of this is Cuba itself, where it hasn't worked for 47 years. But we also see that in North Korea, Iran, and Myanmar, it has been completely ineffective to isolate these nations, and they have just continued to do what we have condemned. No thank you. And this proves our case, because it shows that through sanctions, we only decrease the standard of living in those nations, but do not put pressure on the government, and the government does not fold. And as a consequence, we won't reform to help the people of Cuba. And that brings me on to my second substantive point, which is that, alternatively, we engage, and this promotes progress within Cuba. No, thank you. And there are several reasons why engagement creates more progress from the Cuban government.
Sir?
No, thank you. Firstly, we can see that we can provide incentives for greater cooperation through means of greater trade, through the incentives that can be provided when you do not have an absolutist nuclear policy of no trade whatsoever, ladies and gentlemen. And it is these incentives that provide the kind of development that on-side proposition, and I assume on-side opposition, we do want to see. Secondly, we see that Cuba itself is pretty keen to do some trade with the US. They, in fact, let US citizens into Cuba. It is only the US government which prevents Cuban citizens from going there. They would be happy to trade with the US, but it is the US who prevents them. Isn't this quite an issue?
Well, that's precisely the reason that sanctions work as an incentive for change.
Well, what I already showed you is that they haven't, because the condition on the sanctions is that the regime steps down, and that's not in the regime's interest, ladies and gentlemen. That was very clear. But what we do see is when we can provide step-by-step incentives through removing sanctions and progressively helping Cuba, we do in fact see this change. And furthermore, we see that incentives are better because there is no longer a zero-sum game. It is now can be a win-win situation through negotiations, and thus we will see a better cooperation with Cuba, no thank you. Finally, we see that we now have a different leader of Cuba, Raul Castro. And while he is unwilling to step down and bow to sanctions, he is in fact more open than Fidel was to market economics, more open to trade with the US, so we're more likely to see development. For instance, we see that when we engage with the USSR during Gorbachev's final years in control, no thank you, we did in fact see the liberalization of the USSR because we were not so absolute with us. And that works for our case because it shows us the incentives we provide. And that brings me to my third substantive point. what is the effect of these sanctions on the people? And we see that the effect of these sanctions are harmful because we remove Cuba's largest market. They're not harmful enough to pressure the regime, as we've seen in the last 47 years, but it does remove the option for those people to sell their products, to access products for the US, and that's why their GDP is still $4,000 per person per year, and they're all still driving 1960s Fords with no seat belts, which, ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, is not a pleasant thing. And we see the example of this with trade with China, with trade with Vietnam, which has hugely helped their people. So what have we proven to you already in today's debate, ladies and gentlemen? We've shown you how trade with Cuba and removing sanctions will in fact see greater economic progress. We've shown you how sanctions are ineffective and harmful, and we've shown you how it will help the people of Cuba. The motion stands.
I would like to thank the first proposition speaker for his debate, and before I continue the debate, I would like to ask everybody kindly to shut up their mobile cell phones or any other noise-making devices to refrain it from interrupting the debate. And without further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker of the opposition to open their case. Good luck.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chair, an inconsistent approach to Cuba can only undermine the slow but consistent progress being made. That's the team line of Team Scotland today, and in proving that to you, first of all, I'm going to analyse what the current situation in Cuba is, and secondly, I'm going to look very much in the context of that current situation at what the effect of lifting sanctions would be. And then my partner, Miss Watson's going to move on and just going to look more generally at why sanctions do in fact affect regimes. But before I do that, let's look at what the first speakers brought us, the first 3 points of this case today. So first of all, he told us that this sort of unilateral action is unnecessary. And he told us the very first thing in his speech was that we no longer have the Cold War and communism. And he brought out that as the reason for sanctions within Cuba. Now we on Team Scotland agree that that was one of the reasons originally that sanctions on Cuba were put in place. But what that speaker failed to recognise is that there was another very important reason, a reason that continues to this day, no thank you, that of the human rights abuses. What that speaker from the proposition also failed to recognise was the current situation within Cuba, making it very different from all the other, no thank you, countries that have human rights abuses, i.e. that Cuba has had these sanctions in place for 47 years, and therefore we've got to look at it as a very unique case. The effects of lifting the sanctions within Cuba, of changing an existing consistent approach, no thank you sir, that the US has had on Cuba for 47 years. And that's what I'm going to come on to look at in my case today, no thank you. The effect of fundamentally shifting the US's attitudes in, rather than not just condemning the human rights abuses that are ongoing within Cuba, but actively rewarding Cuba, actively appearing to condone what Cuba's doing at the moment. Let's look at this issue of engagement then, the second point, no thanks, because we were told that isolation doesn't work. What we weren't told though by Team Proposition, no thanks, was why engagement and sanctions were mutually exclusive. That was never proven. In fact, no thanks. Let's give you some examples of why actually, rather than being mutually exclusive, they often work together.
On that point.
No thanks. While the US has had sanctions on Cuba, in September 2000, Castro shook President Clinton's hand. In December 2000, no thanks, Cuba and US officials began talks on immigration issues. And so, through these examples, we can see that engagement does still happen, no thank you, with sanctions, and engagement does still work. So we're not talking about this complete isolation. But in fact, having this consistency of approach through the sanctions, this consistent message being sent to Cuba, no thanks, can actually aid talks, can actually act as a negotiation tool. If we look at the example of South Korea removing aid from North Korea following flooding, as a sort of a form of sanction, no thanks, the effect of that was that North Korea came to six-party talks that South Korea was involved in. That's an example of where using this sort of isolationism, using these sanctions effectively, can lead to actively helping negotiation. And in fact, when the EU lifted its sanctions on Cuba, no thanks, for a period of 6 months, the effect of that was 14 EU politicians being expelled from Cuba, rather than engagement actively being helped, as the proposition would suggest. The third point then, that of economic prosperity. Well, first of all, let's point out that this idea that Cuba is being materially harmed by not trading with the US seems very much in tension with the speaker's first point, which was that it didn't really matter if the US didn't trade with Cuba, no thanks, because it's just one country and it's got all these others. But if we ignore his first point then and accept his sort of contradictory third point idea, then that actually proves our case, and the case that Ms. Watson's going to come on to look at, of why sanctions actually work, no thank you, because they provide a direct harm to Cuba. Let's move on to my case now then. First is the current situation in Cuba. Right, since 1962, the US has had a lot of sanctions on Cuba, military, economic. We were told the only reason for that was the Cold War, no thanks. But we've actually shown you that many of the reasons for that were these human rights abuses. The consistent not providing of the basic democratic freedoms to Cuban people. No thank you. Of fair elections, of opportunities to criticize government. Now we were told that, look, what's happening at the moment, no thank you, sanctions just isn't working. The regime isn't going to want to step down. South America's still trading with Cuba. Essentially, unilateral action by the United States of America won't work. But what the speaker failed to recognize is that the United States of America isn't just any one random unilateral country that decided to impose sanctions on Cuba. No thank you. The United States of America is one of the world's biggest markets. Through trading with America, countries can gain access to fantastic economic prosperity. And through not being able to trade with America, they are denied access to said prosperity, as you yourself, sir, conceded. Yes, please.
The worst human rights abuses in Cuba occur at Guantanamo Bay. Can you explain why you'd be willing to trade with China, which has worse human rights?
The issue is here that we have to look at this in the context of what's been happening over the last 42 years. Not only are we deciding about imposing sanctions on a particular country, we're actively lifting sanctions and actively changing an existing stance on a country that's had sanctions for these 47 years that you mentioned. So that's why Cuba, no thank you, is really relevant to this debate and really important. So the effect of the US not trading with Cuba is that Cuba suffers directly economically. It has a direct disadvantage in offense, as was conceded. The effect also, as Ms. Watson's going to come on to look at in more detail, is that Cuba's denied legitimacy in the eyes of, one, the rest of the world, and two, its people. And having legitimacy in the eyes of your people is a very important thing to a regime such as it happens in Cuba. So slowly, because of these things, we've been seeing a progress, no thank you, and a move towards a Cuba that recognizes human rights more. For example, in 1992, following the US tightening of trade restrictions, now it was around this time, George Bush Sr., that was the time that sanctions and this sort of principle was enforced very strongly. And it was around that time, July 1992, that we saw approved reforms to the 1976 Constitution, which updated political, economic and social laws, including the guarantee of religious freedoms, including the introduction of direct elections to the National Assembly. And so these sanctions have been working slowly, and they've been working consistently. No thank you. But let's look at what happens when we actually lift the sanctions. Because by changing a 40-year consistent approach, what we're suggesting is that such a change, no thank you, is the result of a really fundamental shift in Cuba's policy. But actually that's not the case. There's still these ongoing human rights abuses. In 2007, 70 dissidents were jailed. In 2002, the UN Human Rights Commission called on Cuba to improve its human rights. This year, there was the opportunity for Cuba to take on a democratic change when Fidel Castro stepped down. It didn't, just his brother Raúl was appointed. And so therefore we see that actually human rights abuses continue, and so this inconsistent approach cannot be tolerated. Because furthermore, sanctions don't harm the US. Sanctions on Cuba don't make a significant impact to the US. They do harm Cuba. What that means is it's very much seen as a reward to Cuba were the US to lift sanctions. A reward which Cuba, as I've proved, as of yet, hasn't deserved. And so furthermore, it's really important that the US has this consistent foreign policy towards Cuba in order that its attitude is clear. Confusing the issue like this, being inconsistent, undermines fundamentally the progress that's been made in in Cuba over the last 47 years. I beg to oppose.
I would like to thank the first opposition speaker for his speech, and without further ado, I would like to introduce the second speaker of the proposition to continue their case.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's not enough for the opposition to get up here and say that we need to keep sanctions on Cuba because that's consistent. Because the team line in our case today is that sanctions by the US on Cuba are a consistently ineffective, unnecessary, and harmful approach to dealing with this regime, and that is why we would remove them. The opposition made two arguments, which I'm going to rebut, before moving on to my substantive case, which is that firstly, the only way to achieve true political reform in Cuba is by lifting sanctions, and secondly, how it is unjust to punish the people of Cuba for the faults of their regime. But let's look at what we had from the opposition. So what they said was that firstly, they think it's really important that we achieve progress. And interestingly, it took them till the 6th minute of their case to actually give us any example of any progress that we've actually achieved through sanctions. And the example they gave us was that in 1992, there were sanctions, and there was also a change to the Constitution. Therefore, sanctions equal reform. But ladies and gentlemen, we just don't think that's good enough. And the reasons we gave for this were many. We gave you many logical reasons why we don't think sanctions are going to work. The first thing to consider is that the ultimate aim of these sanctions is to achieve reform and to achieve the removal of the oppressive authoritarian regime that exists. And sanctions will not be removed until that regime is removed. And so the question we have to ask is, how do we remove that regime? But what we've already told you is it's just not in the interest of Raul and Fidel and the rest of the Castro clan to no thank you, to give up their power and to walk away and have sanctions removed. And they've given us no response to that. And the second thing we told you was that the harms that come to the regime from these sanctions aren't great. The harms to the people are huge. I'm going to move on to that soon. But the harms to the regime itself aren't great because of the fact we've still got people like Hugo Chavez coming in and funding and giving the regime the money and the revenue that they need in order to survive. And we also told you that there's simply no internal pressure for the kind of regime change that we need. And we see that in fact they're able to use sanctions as a tool to create resentment for the people against the US. And furthermore, we told you that because of the fact that these sanctions are unilaterally imposed, that means that you're not going to have the effect that you want. And we just had no response to this other than this single example, no thank you, which firstly didn't link the sanctions to the reforms, other than that they occurred at the same time. Because ladies and gentlemen, the Cuban regime also does other good things. They give little kids ice cream 1 litre a week. So we don't think the fact that they did a good thing means that the sanctions are working. And the sanctions don't actually truly work until we achieve regime change, which doesn't occur, no thank you, under the model of the opposing team. No thank you. And so the second argument that we had come out from them was that they think that we haven't actually achieved the whole thing yet because there are still bad things going on. There are still human rights abuses. And we completely agree. And we think that the fact that they're still going on in Cuba where we have huge, heavy sanctions, and they're not, no thank you, and they're actually getting better and improving in places like China, where people have more rights, where there is more judicial freedom, where there is more engagement. We think that proves that the way to achieve, no thank you, the actual development of these rights and stop things like prisoners being taken with no good reason is by engaging. And so what we told you is that we actually see progress through engagement. And what we had, interestingly, from the opposition was a concession that they think engagement is good. But bafflingly, they think the way to achieve engagement is to shake Fidel Castro's hand on one hand and then stop trade with him on the other hand. And we just don't think that that's logical. We see that engagement truly works when you actually are going to approach these people and not have the stick and the carrot going at once. We've told you it didn't work with North Korea, we told you it didn't work with Iran, and it's not working with Cuba, accepted.
But you haven't responded to this idea that by lifting sanctions, we're sending out the active message that we condone the human rights abuses that you admit are still going on.
Well, no, we don't think that it condones human rights abuses to give people the chance to sell their goods to another country and make money and get access to the media and information. And that moves me nicely onto my first substantive point, in fact, which is that the way to achieve political reform is by removing sanctions. So both teams agree that ultimately what we want is political freedom and human rights for the people of Cuba. So the question is, how do we create an environment for this reform to occur? Because we can see that that environment doesn't currently exist. Because if it did exist, we wouldn't have thousands of people building rafts and trying to sail from Cuba to the shores of Miami every day, ladies and gentlemen, to escape their regime. So we say that there are two reasons why removing sanctions does this. The first reason is that it facilitates the growth of a middle class. And this is people who are wealthy, people who are educated, and people who are influential and can influence their governments. And so what we see is that these people are going to act as a counterweight against the state, and they're going to be the ones demanding freedom and rights. And that's exactly, no thank you, what we've seen occurring in China, where the people who own the factories, who are allowed to trade with lots of other countries who don't have sanctions, begin to get rich enough to actually think, well, hey, actually I'd like some rights too, and are pressuring the Chinese government for these rights. And secondly, we say that removal of sanctions leads to the greater freedoms of things like the media. It means that we can allow the foreign press to come in, no thank you, and give information to the Cuban people. And we think information is very important because what it does is it actually gives the people of Cuba an idea about how people live in the outside world, what the principles of democracy are, and what it's like to be free. And we think that that is so important. And our model provides that, and the opposition model explicitly prevents that. And so that is why we can see that on the issue of providing an environment for political reform, by far the best way to do this is to remove sanctions. And a further example of this is what we saw in the USSR, where we saw that economic reform, again, led to the middle class putting pressure on their government, and in the end what we saw, no thank you, was the collapse of that authoritarian regime and the birth of a whole of fantastic democratic nations like Estonia. So now I'd like to move on to my second substantive point, which is that we think imposing sanctions on Cuba is unjust. We think it's firstly unfair on the people of Cuba because what we're doing is we're using sanctions as an instrument to try and punish the state. But in fact, it doesn't punish the state. They still get funding from other South American countries. They still get dairy products from Australia. No thank you. But who it punishes are the people who can no longer make products and trade with the US, who are, as both teams agree, a major trading partner.
So if they're still getting this funding from South American countries that you're talking about, how are the people being punished? Is it a contradiction?
Well, no, it's not a contradiction. The arguments are just different because the benefits go to different people. So under your model, what we have is that all the money and all the good things that come in go to the government, and the government distributes it how they want. They have complete control of the allocation of resources. And so they make sure the people who like them and support them eat, and they make sure the people who don't like them and criticize them don't eat. And we think that is harmful. But we say that under our system, you can actually bypass that because the more free that trade is, what you get is you get things like business-to-business partnerships, you get cooperation, you get foreign influence. The government no longer has complete control, and bypassing that control is one of the key ways that we're going to achieve this. But what we say is that it's just unjust to punish the people economically while the state benefits for something that wasn't their fault. And furthermore, we say it's unfair because, as we've already pointed out, countries like China have human rights abuses as well and hugely bad records. But we don't stop trade with them just because they're a big, important economic market. And so we see that the US is actually just picking and choosing, not based on the needs of the people, not based on the principles of democracy which the opposition think they stand for, but just based on what is convenient for them at the time. It is unjust, it is ineffective, it is unnecessary, and removing sanctions provides a better result for the Cuban people. We are proud to propose.
I would like to thank Mana English for her speech, and would now like to invite Rachel Watson for the second opposition speech in this debate.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, ladies and only undermine slow but consistent progress being made. That is the team line of Team Scotland today, and that's what I'm going to continue to prove, looking at the point of why sanctions can affect a regime and why they can actually implement change, which we've all agreed is what we want to see happen to Cuba at the moment. However, before I go on to look at this, I first must take issue with what the last speaker has told us so far today. Now, first of all, she said that the only aim of sanctions is regime change, and that regime change will never happen because it's not in the interests of the regime. Now, ladies and gentlemen, on Team Scotland today, what we've actually been telling you is what we want these sanctions to achieve is the improvement of human rights. What we want these sanctions to achieve, no thank you, is the progression of Cuba towards democracy, towards a better regime, no thank you. And we see that actually, so we're not just looking for a complete regime change in this way. What we want to do is, no thank you, is help to prevent these human rights problems, no thank you. Now, the difference between Cuba and China, which we also agree does have human rights problems, is that we've had this approach for a long time. And let's look at what happens if you change an approach fundamentally. Because sanctions on Cuba send an extremely clear message to them. No thank you. They say that the US simply does not condone these human rights abuses, that the US is not willing to trade with them in these cases. However, when you remove these sanctions, no thank you, when you actively say that trading will happen, the benefits of the trade with the US, because the benefits are to Cuba rather than to the US itself. When these benefits happen, this will actually, no thank you, improve the regime and make it stronger. That's giving them an active reward for the lack of change. And that is something that Team Scotland is not willing to do. Yes, please.
Can you explain how your model achieves the human rights when the only condition on the removal of sanctions is when the regime changes?
It's better for human rights because it's sending this very, very clear message that human rights abuses are not going to be condoned in any way whatsoever. Only when we see real evidence that human rights are being improved, that they're moves towards democracy, can we then start to lift sanctions and loosen restrictions. Because it has to correlate with this reward. Because what removing sanctions is a direct reward. So this correlation has to happen, and that's where this issue of condoning the abuses comes in. So let's look at this idea, first of all, of how this will achieve political reform, because it's creating the environment, no thank you, for political reform to happen. Now, actually, we see, first of all, there was this contradiction in their case, no thank you, because they said that the sanctions had no benefits, no thank you, had no harms to Cuba, because they could still trade with all these other places. And therefore, but yet, they were still harming people. Now, they tried to answer this by saying that the funding from Venezuela and from other countries that are still supporting the regime comes to the regime, and that they can still trade with other countries. That's all for the regime to distribute. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we don't see that it's going to be any different to the US. If the trading is happening with other countries and money is still getting in, why is that any different to when trading happens with the US and money is still getting in? It's getting to the same people. So this point clearly falls. No thank you. So let's look at why sanctions actually can affect a regime, and therefore why they can be a good way to actually enforce change. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we recognise that sanctions aren't perfect, no thank you. We recognise that they're a very long-term approach. And let's just say now, no thank you, that you still can engage with sanctions. You still can have talks, but you're still keeping this very clear message that human rights abuses that will never ever be condoned. And ladies and gentlemen, on that point, it's simply not good enough to say they give ice cream to children when they're still taking away their human rights. We simply say, this isn't right, no thank you. So sanctions aren't perfect, but they can affect the regime, and this is why. Because firstly, economic sanctions, no thank you, tend to target particularly luxury items, which are things which are particularly pertinent to those who are richer, more powerful within a country, who are actually going to be able to have the most influence within that country. So these are the most people who are most likely to have most influence on the regime. And secondly, we do recognise that sanctions do have an economic detriment to the people. And we say that that's very unfortunate. But we see that actually this does have an impact on the regime itself. Because we were told that there's no unrest within Cuba. And we were told that there is no internal pressure for change. But the very fact that people are leaving Cuba surely shows that they're extremely unhappy with the way they're being made to live there. Yes, please.
So you think the way to achieve reform is to starve people enough so that they're starving so badly that they're going to cause a revolution? Did it work in Zimbabwe?
No, we're not. I'm actually, when I continue my point, I'm going to show it's not actually just because there's going to be a revolution, but it's because the dictator of the country doesn't want to look weak. But that's something I'm going to explain further on as I go along. But the fact is that people can see that they're not having the same kind of quality of life as they would have if the trade happened. They're not being able to sell their products in the way that they want to do. They are being harmed, in a sense, economically. And we see that that is what happens. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let's look at what keeps a dictator in power. Thank you. And let's look at what their interests actually are. Because, ladies and gentlemen, we concede that a dictator of a country probably doesn't care very much about their people, and they're probably not going to mind particularly for their people's sake if that population is harmed. What they do care about, and what they very much care about, is keeping control over that population, of appearing as strong as they possibly can, of appearing to give those people the best way of life so that there is no unrest, so that there is no civil disobedience, and so that they can maintain power in the way that they want. And we see that actually, that sanctions directly go against this, and that's why they target the regime. Because what sanctions show is they show that due to the actions of the dictator, due to the actions of the regime, this is meaning that people can't be provided for in the way that they want. And this makes the dictator look much weaker. Let's look at the example of South Africa, where the economic sanctions crippled the poorer, specifically black population within South Africa. What that led to was township uprising, which affected the other groups within that society, which then led to more wish to see reform, to end those sanctions, and to actually have that incentive. The incentive to change can't happen if there isn't a reason for that incentive to happen. There isn't an incentive to change if the trade is already happening. The incentive comes where the trade is being denied. Let's look at the converse of that. Where sanctions are lifted, this shows that the regime is strong. This shows that the regime has won over the powers that were trying to harm it. So it's actually actively benefiting it. It's actively giving it a reward when it has done nothing to help the human rights abuses. And that is something we cannot condone. Ladies and gentlemen, because an inconsistent approach rewards the regime, I beg to oppose.
I would like to thank Ms. Watson for her speech and now invite the last constructive speaker of the proposition, Jen Savage, to speak.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Team New Zealand, the proposition recognises an outdated policy that's use went cold years ago. On the other hand, we've got an opposition who's absolutely pro-consistency just for the sake of sending a message. Well, on side proposition, we say this consistency is the problem, and that for 40 years, there has consistently been no change. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's why the US should lift all sanctions on Cuba as of now. Now, I'm going to be examining why this is in 3 questions. The first is, are these sanctions, as they stand at the moment, necessary and just? The second question is, will sanctions be effective at all in terms of making changes that both teams want? And then the third is, what are the harms or the benefits that accrue from taking sanctions away? So now to this first idea of, are sanctions necessary and just? Well, we came out here very clearly and explained the historical facts, which when the Cold War was on, the dictator got changed over, the US wasn't happy and put the sanctions on. No, thank you. Now, the opposition came out and and changed the facts and said, in fact, no, the sole reason and the biggest reason was human rights. Well, we say one, that's factually not true, but let's look at it even if. Well, we've been told human rights is the biggest problem in Cuba, and we changed this by sending a message and isolating them. Well, ladies and gentlemen, for 40 years, this policy isn't working so well. But secondly, this isn't the reason, and this is an inconsistent reason. We pointed you to the example of China, who has bad human rights and are communists, and we trade with them. We pointed you to Vietnam, who have nearly even worse human rights, are also communists, and we trade with them. No, thank you. So what we do see is the reason that Cuba was different because of the Cold War, the outdated policy we pointed you to. So human rights is not the reason for the sanctions. Do not be fooled, ladies and gentlemen. But what we did tell you about the reasons I'll take in a moment is this cause is outdated and it's inconsistent. We trade with all these other places with bad human rights, and in fact the worst human rights that occur, that's in Guantanamo Bay, ladies and gentlemen, in the US. That was brought up in a POI and, interestingly enough, never responded to.
The difference is that by lifting 47-year sanctions, you're actively condoning these human rights abuses which you admit happened.
Thank you. Now what the US is doing is sitting back and going, current approach not working, we need a better one. And so they're making a change. And I'm going to be looking at this idea of condoning it in the very next point. Sorry, in the third point. So we'll get to it in more detail. So what we see in terms of are the sanctions necessary and just? No, they're not. They're outdated and they're not achieving anything. And we were told, all these things are achieving, progress is happening, and it took till the 6 minutes till we got one example of a handshake, ladies and gentlemen, and we say that that isn't good enough. So no, thank you. Now I'm going to look at the second question of, are these sanctions even effective at all? And we told you they're not, and the reason they're not is because they're unilateral. It's the US standing alone in the corner saying we won't trade. No thank you. Meanwhile, Australia's getting in there and giving them all their dairy products. Everyone else is getting in there, like Hugo Chavez, and giving them other things they need. But ladies and gentlemen, no thank you, before they jump up and tell us, well, if they're getting all these products from everyone else, it doesn't really matter that they don't get them from the US, because things must be pretty hunky-dory and great for them anyway, because they're getting them from other people. Ladies and gentlemen, the people that are getting them are the dictators at the top, not the people on the ground, which is why, ladies and gentlemen, the GDP per capita there is only $4,000 compared to you in the US, where it's about $40,000. So it's not that great for the people.
So what's so special about US trade that means that the people at the lower levels are going to get it any different from what you've just described?
Well, maybe we should ask your own first speaker what's so special about first US trade. When she came out here and pointed out the reason that sanctions work is because US trade is so important to them, because it's the biggest market and because they really want it, which is our chief incentive and our kingpin for our case, ladies and gentlemen. And now you've got a third speaker who's like, well, the US doesn't really matter and they don't care about them. So I'd like Team Opposition to sort their own case out on this issue. Now, what we told you about trade and isolation engagement versus isolation working is this kind of unilateral engagement, doesn't work. And what the opposition had to say is, oh no, isolation does work. We'd point you to North Korea, and they went to six-party talks. The reason North Korea worked, ladies and gentlemen, is because every other person in the world was standing back saying, we won't trade with you. It wasn't just one person, it was multilateral isolation, and that's why it worked. No, thank you. So what kind of progress under the opposition are we seeing is apparently occurring already? Well, it's this lovely idea which goes, you can be friends with them and be mean to them all in one nifty idea, and it's called engagement and isolation put together. You shake hands with one hand and you take away all their trade on the other. And this is effective because there was a handshake, and that's just progress. And then because people are talking, and that's progress. No, thank you. Well, if they're talking, that's great, but nothing's being changed. Nothing's being done. Dialogue is empty if no concrete things are actually happening. So we say the fact that after 40 years of a consistent, which the opposition supports, a nice consistent policy from the US, after 40 years of this consistency, they can't point us to actual concrete benefits for the people. But what have they told us in terms of why they will change, why it will be effective, the sanctions? Because the incentives will be there. When we hold things away from them, they'll want to take them. And we just pointed you to the fact that that hasn't changed, ladies and gentlemen. Fidel and Raul are quite happy with their own goods. They are the ones with the cigars, not us, ladies and gentlemen. So this nicely onto my third point about when we take away these sanctions, will we see harms, as we've told you, benefits, as we've told you, or will we apparently see harms? Now, first we're going to look at these apparent harms, and that, well, there is pressure because the government can't get luxury items, and that would be a big harm. Well, I've just told you how they're quite happy with their own cigars, and this kind of incentive doesn't work holding away luxury items, such as in Zimbabwe. Not doing so flashy a job right now, ladies and gentlemen. But the second apparent harm they pointed us to was legitimising the regime, and this was a huge point, no thank you from the opposition, about legitimising the regime. We reward the fact there's no progress. We fold, we appear weak, no thank you, and we send a clear message to them that we don't mind you didn't make progress because we're going to back down. Well, what we say instead is when you continue with this kind of policy, that country, that government can capitalise on the fact you're isolating and use the isolation to rally support, use the isolation to further grow anti-Western sentiment. On the contrary, when you do start trading with them, you can undermine that propaganda to the people. And the reason we know the people are quite keen to get some interaction with the world is they're leaving in rafts, ladies and gentlemen, to try and get here. They're converting their old Chevys into boats to try and get here, ladies and gentlemen. So we see, in fact, that the Cuban people would be open to this kind of idea. And we told you about the benefits, like the economic growth we saw in China and Vietnam. By the way, opposition, we used to have sanctions on China. We lifted them, and then what did we see? Economic growth. And what did that lead to? Political growth, ladies and gentlemen. And these are the benefits, the concrete benefits we've pointed you to on the proposition today. So what we've said is this policy outdated, it's gone cold, and we need a new approach. The consistency is not working, and this is why we should lift sanctions.
I would like to thank Ms. Savage for her speech, and I would now like to introduce the third opposition speaker, which is Joanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the proposition today have come to us with a proposition which has tried to prove that, first of all, sanctions are no longer necessary. And secondly, they've also tried to look at, instead of sanctions, what actually is the best way to engage with the people in Cuba and therefore to bring about change within Cuba. So let's look at these 2 points and show you why actually both these points have fallen. So first of all, let's look at this idea of why sanctions are no longer necessary. And first of all, a team from New Zealand came forward and had this very simplistic idea that the Cold War is over, so we no longer need the sanctions. But ladies and gentlemen, the Cold War is over. Yes, we don't disagree with historical fact on Team Scotland here. However, what's happened in Cuba since then is that the changes that people in the West had a problem with during the Cold War, such as the human rights abuse, such as the fact that there's no media freedom, for example, no thank you. These sort of human rights abuses still exist in Cuba. And that's why sanctions are still important within Cuba, because it's still important that we take all necessary action in order to stop the human rights abuses that exist. No thank you. So then we were told, let's actually look then at the human rights changes that have been partly successful by what's happened in Cuba because of the sanctions. Now, we on Team Scotland, we're not saying, no thank you, that there's been a fundamental change in the human rights situation in Cuba. No thank you. The problem here, it's an issue of scale, no thank you, because we think what's happened with the imposition of sanctions is that we have allowed small, slow, consistent change, ladies and gentlemen. Change such as, no thank you, the 1992 constitutional changes, which New Zealand have failed to respond to. No thanks. However, on the whole picture, we still see that human rights problems still exist in Cuba. And then we had this idea from New Zealand about why are we treating Cuba any differently from any of the other countries that we have human rights problems with. So first of all, no thank you, we have this idea that we've talked a lot to you about today, this idea of precedence.
this idea that what we're doing when we're taking away sanctions from Cuba is we're actually rewarding them for nothing that they've done, ladies and gentlemen, because the problems in Cuba remain so large. However, there's another reason that Cuba is a different situation from China. Because if we look at a country like China, we see a very different power balance between China and the United States, and Cuba and the United States. No thanks. Cuba needs the United States' economic assistance in order to prosper, ladies and gentlemen. The difference in the case with China, however, is that China doesn't actually need the United States. So there would be no practical benefit of imposing sanctions upon a country like China. No thanks. So we think it's important, because of this issue of the power balance, that we therefore take a very consistent approach. Yes, please.
If removing sanctions is folding to the regime, how is Fidel Castro shaking Clinton's hand not also condemning the regime?
Because the difference we've tried to explain to you today on Team Opposition is that there is a very different significance between economic sanctions and political engagement, and the two can actually work hand in hand, because the economic sanctions work as a strong condemnation of what happens in Cuba. But we think it would be silly to just leave Cuba totally isolated on its own, because it needs to work hand in hand with a sort of political engagement. No, thank you. And that's the sort of thing we see with engagement, such as the handshaking with Clinton. So that's why we see that sanctions are still actually necessary, because it sends out this very strong message. The second proposition said that we would be doing this just for the sake of a message. No, thank you. That's the fundamental point, ladies and gentlemen. It is for the sake of a message. Because if we don't have this message sent out to Cuba that what they're doing is fundamentally wrong, then change will never happen. No, thank you. So then let's look at this idea that New Zealand brought to us today about what is actually the best way to achieve change. Now, they have this idea that we need to have, first of all, no thank you, economic engagement with Cuba. So let's look at an example that New Zealand haven't responded to. Let's look at the example of when the EU temporarily lifted its sanctions upon Cuba. No, thank you. Nothing actually happened in Cuba to change. Actually, what happened was that 14 European politicians were expelled from Cuba. No, thank you. So we don't see that this economic engagement actually leads to any sort of change. So then let's look at this idea that they brought to the table about the idea that economic engagement automatically leads to liberalisation in a political sense. But we disagree with that, and in fact, we think that New Zealand have, at some points in their own speech, disagreed with that, ladies and gentlemen. Because they've tried to tell us that currently what happens, no thank you, is that the regime in Cuba is able to get all the things it needs from countries like Venezuela, from other South American countries. So therefore we see that actually Cuba is surviving at the moment. No thank you. But then at the same time they've tried to tell us that the US is really, really fundamentally important. Now we would agree with this second approach, that the US is really, really fundamentally important to economic change within Cuba. And that's why it's important that the sanctions exist. Yes?
Did removing sanctions from China harm or help the human rights of the Chinese people?
Well, we wouldn't exactly say, ladies and gentlemen, that the human rights in China are great at the moment. There's not been this massive fundamental change that we've heard from on Team New Zealand. The difference as well with Cuba is that the economic sanctions have gone on for so long now, and there has been no change within Cuba that to remove them would send these messages, which New Zealand don't think are important, but we fundamentally think are important. It would send these messages that Cuba has done something good that it deserves rewarding. So let me go back to my point about how we think the US is important in an economic sense to Cuba. The US, we've had this idea from New Zealand that at the moment what happens is all the stuff that comes from Venezuela and Australia is kept by the regime and distributed by the regime. They've tried to tell us without really any sort of analysis whatsoever why this would be any different when the US did this. So we think there's a little bit of a contradiction here. They said that places like Australia and Venezuela, all the things go to the regime and the top level, and the economic incentive goes to this top level of the regime. But again, why is this going to be any different at a lower level? The chief incentive is still going to remain at this top level that we've heard about. So because the US is such a major economic bloc in the area that particularly affects Cuba, the effect is most felt, following Team New Zealand's logic, by the top level of government. And that's why they have the economic incentive to change. So New Zealand tried to show us that an inconsistent approach works, ladies and gentlemen. But all an inconsistent approach to Cuba does is undermine the slow but consistent progress that's been made. Such as Australia, trade with Cuba. But actually the problem with this is, as was admitted by their third speaker, the trade that happens doesn't go to the people, it goes to the regime. And therefore, as she admitted, trade sanctions thus affect the regime by that logic. And so the importance of the United States as an economic power, as one of the biggest economic powers in the world, thus by this logic, we can see that that US sanctions are very important to Cuba because of the important economic market that could be provided, but that's denied to them. And so Rachel proved to you that sanctions work very effectively. Firstly, because they target the regime in particular, by looking at the sort of luxury items that the regime are interested in. Secondly, because any harm that happens to the people through trade sanction, in turn helps the regime, in turn harms the regime. Because it makes the regime look weaker in the eyes of its people. And it makes the regime look weaker in the eyes of the international community. And we gave you lots of examples of where trade sanctions have worked. South Korea, not giving aid to North Korea after flooding, encouraging North Korea to go to six-party talks. South Africa, sanctions which affect the most powerful people, helping to implement peaceful reforms. In turn, we didn't hear from New Zealand engagement on these examples. We were asked repeatedly, why not other countries? Why not China? Firstly, we told you you've got to engage with the current situation in Cuba. 47-year sanctions, the effect of lifting them on inconsistency. That's what I'm going to come to look on next. Secondly, we showed you the importance of the US's economic power over Cuba, meaning that the US power makes the sanctions much more effective than, say, would happen with China. And finally, we were told by New Zealand that we're being really unjust. But we actually didn't understand this argument from New Zealand, considering that the third speaker said that the multilateral sanctions that took place with North Korea was great. She totally agreed with that. So in principle, she completely agreed that sanctions are just. In principle, she conceded our case. Let's look then at the effect of lifting sanctions. Because what we showed you is that currently in Cuba there's a slow and consistent progress of human rights reform. And we gave examples of that. Constitutional reforms, such as the 1976 Constitution, improving religious freedom. Engaging with the US in terms of shaking hands with President Clinton. So what New Zealand had to prove to us, that improvements would be better than this consistent improvement. They only really gave us two reasons for that. Firstly, engagement. We showed you that the two aren't mutually exclusive, such as the 2000 talks on immigration with the US. And we also showed you that when the EU lifted sanctions, rather than helping engagement,
14 EU politicians were expelled from Cuba. They told us that we'd help the middle class and increase free press. But actually, if the regime is still preventing this, if the regime is still in power, then none of these things can happen, thus none of what you're suggesting can work, and so sanctions need to be there to put pressure on the regime, as I've shown you. By contrast, what we've proved is that taking away sanctions is a changing an existing consistent line, and thus sending out a very clear and active message of condoning the current situation in Cuba in terms of human rights. That's something we can't do, because of in 2007, 70 dissidents being jailed. We can't give legitimacy to these abuses. So, ladies and gentlemen, an inconsistent approach to Cuba can only undermine consistent progress.
Thank you, Ms. Smith, for this speech, and I would call upon Ben Cornfield to give the revised speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, at the beginning of today's debate, we told you we were going to prove that continuing sanctions did three things to Cuba: that it was unnecessary, that it was ineffective, and that it harmed the Cuban people. These three things still stand at the end of today's debate. The opposition case was that it undermined the slow and steady progress we made with Cuba. However, to quote every single one of their speakers, which pointed to the lack of progress we made with Cuba as a reason not to remove sanctions, their case precisely showed why their case could not be true. Now, to this first issue of clash, is it unnecessary? And we said that the Cold War is over, and they conceded that. But we also showed you how we trade with other communist nations, and we trade with other countries which have much worse human rights. And we pointed you to China and Vietnam as examples of this. And they didn't care about this inconsistency. The only inconsistency they cared about was the message that we sent. And we said, frankly, ladies and gentlemen, we want to pursue the best policy of improving these human rights, regardless of the direct message that sends. But furthermore, we showed you that it doesn't send an inconsistent message, because after 30 years of sanctions on China, we removed those. After 30 years of sanctions on Vietnam, we showed you how we removed those, and how successful each one of those were on improving the human rights situation in those nations. And thus, for the very goal they have of improving human rights, all the empirical and logical evidence suggests side proposition. They never responded, furthermore, into this argument to how it was unjust, except for in their leader's reply, and then it was inadequate, ladies and gentlemen. And thus, on this first issue of is this in fact necessary, we can show you that we don't want an inconsistent message between China and Cuba, but what we do want is the best way of making progress, and that's achieved by side proposition. The second question was, is this effective? And we showed you how when the only condition for lifting sanctions is regime change, there is never a question of the incentives that are provided for that regime. They are not to fold. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was something that the proposition never grappled with. But we also showed you further reasons why this was not true. We showed you why people still support the government, so sanctions are ineffective, because these are the same people who supported the revolution. We showed you how the government itself can still trade with Venezuela. The government itself still trades with Australia, and thus can maintain power. And they were confused on this issue, ladies and gentlemen, but not due to a lack of clarity from side proposition. We also showed you how economic engagement was effective. We showed you how it can provide progressive incentives that cannot be provided by the all or nothing mechanism of sanctions. They didn't respond to that. We showed you how the recent change to Raúl will make more liberalization, and we showed you how Cuba is keen to economically engage. And their only response was that political engagement was not mutually exclusive. But very clearly, ladies and gentlemen, we were talking about economic engagement. And what they told you was that, well, there are incentives to change, and they never realized that these incentives don't exist when the only condition on sanctions is regime change, as is the case, ladies and gentlemen. And that was something they never recognized, and they themselves admitted we have not seen progress for 47 years. So finally, we have this issue of does it harm the people? Now that we've seen that for 47 years they've been ineffective and still are. We showed you very clearly that it does harm the people because the US is a large market. It harms the people, but not enough to harm the government with the clear line throughout our case and something they never grappled with. But furthermore, they never contested that it harms the people. And because it does so, because it's ineffective to have sanctions, and because the sanctions are unnecessary, the motion stands.
I would like to thank both teams for this very, very good debate. And I would like to ask everybody to remain very calm and very quiet while the adjudicators finalize their markup sheets and make this very, very hard decision.